Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Marc Lesser. Now, Marc is got a fascinating background, and I'd have to say, I just loved doing this interview. His background, he's a CEO of business, he's an executive coach, and he's a Zen teacher. And he was a resident of the San Francisco Zen Center for 10 years, loads of other things, was involved with Google in the setting up of the program, Search Inside Yourself, which I just loved the program, which I read about. I didn't do it, but I read about it and I absolutely loved it. But he's got a new book coming out, Finding Clarity, and there's a subtext to that I talk about in the interview. But we really, really get into the benefits of clarity, of finding clarity in your life and in your work. We also talk about mindfulness. And I did raise the point that it's kind of a little bit hackneyed in some ways and maybe being a bit diminished with everybody talking about it. But he does really kind of lean into that. And I ask him about that, and he does have some great answers. And we also talk about psychological safety. So this is I found this a fascinating interview. I found his take and to be honest with you, also his simplicity in his explanation, and the clarity in his explanation was actually quite extraordinary. So I really do encourage you to listen to this interview with Marc Lesser. Great. In order, if you could please give us a review, give us, a thumbs up wherever you actually do listen to your podcast, because the whole objective is to get out and reach more people. So please do that. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy, as I did, the really, really fascinating Marc Lesser. Marc, thank you so much for joining us on the Winning Teams podcast. It's a great honor to have you here.
John, it's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. You're a man with a very interesting background. You're a CEO, you're an executive coach, you're a Zen teacher, but that really kind of falls very short of describing what you have done. You were a resident of the San Francisco Zen Center for 10 years. You're a director of Tazajara, do I pronounce that correctly?
Tassajara.
Zen Mountain Center, which is the first Zen monastery in the Western world. You also lead the weekly meditation group Mill Valley Zen, focused on Zen teaching and practices. And you're part of developing the world famous Search Inside Yourself program in Google, which I have to say, and I said to you before we started recording, I found to be one of the most extraordinary books and programs that I kind of read about. I think it's fantastic. But that really integrates the kind of the mindfulness, the emotional intelligence, and the business savvy for the corporate world. That's quite a journey. How did that progress, and how did that move through that arc?
Yeah, well, I think in some way there were a few ahas along the way. One was a 10-year leave of absence from Rutgers, or it was a 1-year leave of absence that turned into 10 years at the San Francisco Zen Center. But interesting how I kept getting asked and finding myself in leadership roles within this, Zen community. And the height of that was my 10th year. I was asked to be director of what is a Zen monastery, but it turns into a conference center and a workshop center with 80 overnight guests and staff and all of the problems and opportunities of any small business. And it was in that role that I realized that I was running a business and that I was involved in leadership. And one, I was having a really good time. And two, I wondered, why wasn't everyone integrating self-awareness practices, mindfulness practice, meditation in with leadership? It just seemed like it just made a whole lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And I ended up kind of making that. I look back and I was kind of surprised myself, but I went right from there to getting an MBA degree. And I started a publishing company, and I started and grew a company that at one point had about 25 employees, and
Oh, wow.
we were shipping greeting cards and calendars all over the world. And when I left that company, wondering what I would do next, I got a call from Google asking if I would come and help develop a mindfulness meditation emotional intelligence project inside of Google's headquarters. So those were some of the key notes on my own journey.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because you're talking about, yeah. I mean we do talk a lot about mindfulness in leadership role. We talk about it, right? And I do say that carefully, right? Um, but going back a number of years ago, that was kind of way out there to a very large extent. I mean, it's almost become kind of too much of something that we talk about now. But in a sense, I just wonder, how was that accepted at the time, and what was the resistance that you were getting to that?
Well, it was interesting that in the early days of teaching mindfulness and emotional intelligence leadership at Google, we had to start with the
Mm.
science of meditation. And it was interesting that this was a very kind of exciting time when there was a tremendous amount of research going on and some interesting findings about how meditation affects the brain and gray matter, as well as things like communication and builds self-awareness. And at the same time, there's also a lot of research and data on the benefits of emotional intelligence.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that I think we were really good at was creating safe and vibrant spaces for Google engineers, so that they used to call it that coming to our trainings, they could take their game faces off. They could be more vulnerable. They could be more human. And and so we started experimenting with doing some trainings at Google headquarters, and they became immensely popular. So it was really interesting how they exploded in popularity inside of Google. And then once we had, I think, the credibility of the Google name to bringing mindfulness and emotional intelligence into organizations, we started spreading the work all around the world with big, small, medium sized, for
Yeah,
profit, nonprofit companies.
yeah,
There's tremendous interest.
yeah. And I mean, this is going to sound like a really crass question in some ways, but I'll ask it one way or the other. But in terms of the work that you did, I mean, and I know that an organization like Google is very data driven. Um, were you able to correlate the impact of the emotional intelligence and the mindfulness to the results that the organization was getting?
I used to jokingly say, "Hey, if you think there's any, doubt about this, look at Google's stock price." But no, there was, um, uh, you know, Google actually ended up training thousands of employees in this program. Um, Surprisingly, I'm not aware that even though they do tremendous amount of data collection, it wasn't something that they were more trusting in the feedback and the experience that people were having. Many companies have now. There's quite a bit of data
Yeah,
about at least the correlation between mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and even
mm,
ROI.
yeah,
One company that does a tremendous amount of these trainings is the big German-based company SAP.
yes,
And you can go on their website, and I think they've actually published, you know, even, again, ROI statistics that they've gathered about how the more mindful and emotional intelligent leaders are, that it has an impact in their bottom line as a company.
yeah, absolutely. Mark, I want to focus on your new book, which is called Finding Clarity: How Compassionate Accountability Builds Vibrant Relationships, Thriving Workplaces, and Meaningful Lives. You need a big book actually to put the title on, don't you? In that sense. But I having looked at it, it's got incredible reviews. I mean, even notably from so was somebody that I would say is one of my heroes, is John Kabat-Zinn. Just an enormous fan of his. But explain to me, kind of in that title, you talk about compassionate accountability. I mean, I've heard plenty of adjectives that have been tagged onto accountability, but I don't think I've ever heard compassionate
Mhm.
accountability. What does compassionate accountability actually mean?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to start with what accountability means. And it's interesting that the word accountability and the practice does not have a good reputation.
Mm,
Usually people think of lack of or that dreaded performance review. But to me, as I began to delve into studying accountability, a better word is almost alignment, because so much of accountability is aligning with our own values with what we're doing. So there's that self, are we holding ourselves accountable? And then so much of the world of relationship, again, it's aligning with each other's sense of what does success look like and how are we working together. So as soon as you use the word, I think people like alignment. Alignment, people get the importance of that in the business world. But when we use that term accountability, again, it usually feels kind of harsh and cold. And I really like combining it with, on the one hand, this kind of sense of alignment, honesty, clarity, and at the same time bringing in a word like compassion, which means care and trust, and even a sense of love, so I think that I've started working with several large for-profit and nonprofit clients who, when they heard me use this phrase and describe a little bit about what I meant by compassionate accountability, they said, "Oh, that's the kind of culture we want. We want a culture that is high in accountability and high in trust and care and compassion." So that's
mm.
where that came from.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Because very often I mean, if when you work in large organizations like I do, and very often you hear that the need for accountability, and and that's very much kind of delivering on promises in many ways. And when you talk about it in that sense of kind of doing what I say I will do, delivering what I say, it's not the kind of or else, but it is that kind of internal drive to actually, yes, I'm going to fulfill what I have said. And when you look at that, it's that mutual accountability is such a hallmark of high performing teams.
And in so many ways, I was just involved, with looking at someone's job description, right? I mean, what happens is we write these job descriptions and we put them on the shelf. But imagine you write a job description and then you're actually holding each other accountable for what it is your job is. And I mean, everyone I think wants to be successful, right? We want to be successful at work, but where things really go off the rails is when there is just a lack of accountability and a lack of clarity. And it's hard work. It takes
Yeah.
ongoing, difficult conversations, ongoing reviewing what does success look like and how's it going and what are the gaps and where do we need to close the gaps? These this is the real work, I think, of leadership and effectiveness and businesses that work and where there is cultures that are both effective, and where there's a sense of well-being.
Mm. And it's interesting because you mentioned the word there, clarity, because I mean, in order to hold people accountable or hold yourself accountable, you need to be clear about what it is you've actually got to deliver, right? Which also,
Yes.
and that's one of the topics. I mean, your book is Finding Clarity, called Finding Clarity. I mean, apart from some of the obvious benefits of kind of finding clarity, what parts of your life does clarity really impact?
Every part, right? I mean, and this is why, that you read the long subtitle, because it's about the individual it's about relationships, and it's about, work cultures.
Mhm.
So clarity is completely involved in every one of those, but certainly starting with, you know, how are you are you living in reality, or are you someone who is completely, anytime there's any sense of tension or difficulty or conflict, do you get into a fight or flight mode, right?
Mhm.
Are you overreacting or underreacting? And so the more clear we can see, starting, I think, with our own strengths and growth points and our own tendencies, um, that learning and training ourselves to be more clear is the starting point to having healthy relationships. And then, of course, that's essential in creating work cultures that are both healthy and effective.
Okay. And just let me just dig into that. When you say clarity about what? I mean, what are the things that we need to be clear about that are really going to help us to develop, lives that are fulfilled, lives that are fulfilling, and also are meaningful to the people that are around us?
Yeah. Well, I would say starting with, so right. So the first chapter in my book, Finding Clarity, is be curious, not furious. And the next chapter is drop the story, right? Because I think we need to be clear about the story that we're telling about who we are, the story of self, right? The story of self. And now we all need to, a good healthy ego is important and fine, but if we are taking ourselves a bit too seriously, taking our views a bit too seriously, then it becomes hard to have effective and healthy conversations around accountability if we don't realize that we all process information differently. We all have different strengths and growth areas when it comes to emotions and self-awareness, and I think this whole realm of self-awareness and emotions and emotional intelligence is so core for whether it's our family relationships or our business relationships.
Mm. I bring it back to the mindfulness, and as I said a number of years ago, if you talked about mindfulness in business, people looked at you a bit oddly. But now it's actually nearly gone to the other extreme, where people kind of go, "Well, so what?" Right? I mean, I've heard all of this, but from your experience, and you've obviously got incredibly deep experience in this space, why should we lean into mindfulness? Why is that something that we should embrace on a day by day basis?
Yeah, the work that we did at Google, we called mindfulness-based emotional intelligence. So I think people in the business world, leaders and pretty much everyone, I think get how essential emotional intelligence is in the
Mm.
workplace. But it's interesting that, Daniel Goleman, who popularized it like, more than 30 years ago, he wrote his second book. There was a chapter in his second book called The $1 Billion Mistake, describing how every big company brought emotional intelligence programs and trainings in, and they all failed. And they failed because they didn't have the mindfulness element of it. So, and what I mean by that is they weren't looking at the somatic element or the body element, that it's hard to, you can't shift your emotional intelligence by reading about it. And the trainings were like, computer programming trainings.
Mm.
And so we need to bring in the body, but we also need to bring in the filters of which we are using to see ourselves and the world. And this is one way to describe, this big umbrella phrase of mindfulness. Again, it's, to me, mindfulness is this enormously wide and deep study practices. But one way to talk about it is that it's the study of our awareness. It's the study of our filters. Or even going back to what I was alluding to earlier, it's becoming more and more familiar with how we respond anytime we're feeling any sense of pressure or tension or anxiety. Is our do we, do we you know, are we fight, flight, or or become frozen?
Right.
That's one, again, I think that's one very understandable way to describe mindfulness practice is how do we respond, and how are we spinning stories and spinning emotions, especially in difficult situations.
Yeah. It's kind of giving you that space, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. So one way to describe mindfulness is, right, instead of from compulsion to choice, from
Mm.
compulsion to freedom, to have more freedom in our who we are, our way of being, to become more flexible. And that all is based, I think, on being able to live more with a sense of what's actually happening, as opposed to, when we're scanning for threats, or in some way when
Mm.
we're avoiding or over responding.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about in the book, again, it's in the subtitle, is about thriving workplaces. And one of the topics that comes up a lot when you talk about thriving workplaces is the concept and the reality of psychological safety. Um, and I'm just curious, from your perspective and with the experience that you've had and the work that you have done, what needs to be in place in order to have the psychological safety? And if I could tag something else on, is that how you deal within that psychological safety, how you actually balance that with dealing with conflict head on, because
Mhm.
they can't be mutually exclusive.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, well, this question that you're raising, I feel like it builds on all of the things that we're talking about, in
Mm.
terms of you can't have psychological safety without self-awareness, without a deep curiosity and listening practice, without a kind of vulnerability. So it's more of a way of being in the world than it is. You can't say, I'm going to turn on psychological safety.
Mm.
It needs to be authentic. It needs to be genuine. And again, it starts, I think, with the individual in training ourselves to be a more genuine, vulnerable, real human being. And this is, I think this was a big one of the reasons that mindfulness and emotional intelligence are becoming more and more accepted in the workplace, is that I think for the past, 100 years or longer, there was this underlying assumption that humanness and emotions bad for business. Let's root them
Mm.
out.
Yeah, yeah.
And now that may be well, I don't even think it's true on an assembly line, quite frankly. But
No.
there we have been working subtly and not so subtly with what I think of as an assembly line mentality in how business is supposed to run. And in order to do that, we need to get all the humanity out. And this was, I think, a big aha, even, not that long ago, with Google's headquarters. Like, oh, we need more collaboration. We need teams that are working together. And this is actually where this phrase, as I understand it, psychological safety, came from, was a study that Google did, wondering, why is it that some teams are perform out way outperform other teams? They really wanted to understand that. And they were surprised that one of the key findings was that teams that were higher in psychological safety way outperformed teams that lacked it.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I really want to talk about, and you mentioned it earlier on, because one of the things that I always feel very passionate about, and is ensuring that I, in my own world, that I maintain a curiosity, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And you talk about curiosity, and I'd love to hear your take on it. But I'd also love to hear your take on that, is because you say that it's, why is it that it's more difficult than we think it is, right? So maybe just elaborate on that curiosity, and why is it more difficult?
Yeah, yeah. I think that again, things like cynicism is easy, especially in the work world, or even in family life. It's very easy to think that we know what's going on,
Mm.
right? And that uh, and it can be a bit of a tricky concept, to step back and realize, like, how the hell did we get here? Like, what does it mean? What is consciousness? How did consciousness develop? How did we human beings develop? And and just to start to ask, questions about what it is we're doing and how we got here and what we really want to be doing when we grow up. So to me, this is a foundational practice of just being a bit more curious about everything. Um, even with maybe a touch of not knowing, maybe a touch of awe. To be a bit, there's something to me about awe as a practice. I mean, I look out my window at a tree, and it's like, man, these, like, we just take these things for granted, or the people that we live with or that we work with. It's easy to get, to succumb to the ordinariness and the strains. It's not about um, you know under evaluating how, the pains and difficulties and strains of being human, of money and livelihood and family life, all those things. But the other side of it is to realize, I think, the sacredness of life. And again, underneath that, I think, is the sense of profound curiosity about pretty much everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, two things I just wrote down when you were talking there. One is cynicism is easy. And I'm just going to take that away with me because you're right. It is easy to be cynical, right? It is easy to be
It's
cynical.
very safe, like, man, it makes
Yeah,
me I feel good, like
yeah.
all those people or what, but I walk into workplaces sometimes, and I sometimes describe it. It's like a fish tank where the water has not been changed in a while, and no one sees it because there's a general level of cynicism. There's a general level of we kind of know how other people are going to react and what they're going to say, and somehow it takes some real shift in mindset and curiosity, and that's one of the things about, as I was describing, bringing in some of these programs around mindfulness and emotional intelligence. Like, go into an organization where people have been sitting next to each other for 10 years, and they've never bothered to look and say, who are you?
Yes,
How-
yeah,
you
yeah.
know
Extraordinary, isn't
you
it?
know again, it's not that this is going to be, the main topic, but really, we've never said, tell me about how you doing with things. How do you feel about working here? Tell me a little bit about your family. Tell me a little bit about what do you like to do. And it turns out that if we can undo a little bit of that cynicism and create a bit more connection and trust and curiosity, everything goes better at the workplace. You don't have to spend as much time protecting your back. You can let go of some of the cynicism and the politics. And again, this is very aspirational, but why not? Why shouldn't we
Yeah,
aspire to be full human beings? Why shouldn't we aspire to have healthy workplaces?
yeah. I think just to go back to your metaphor about the fish tanks. I mean, we don't see that the water is a bit murky because that's what we've been swimming in,
That's
right?
right.
That's
Yeah,
that
that's right.
that.
When, I would say that many, many work cultures could be characterized by cynicism, an
Yeah,
agreement around cynicism, because it's hard. It is hard to be genuine, authentic, vulnerable when you're trying to get stuff done, when there's money involved, when the stakes are high, when you're concerned about, am I going to lose my job? Like, man, like, how do you manage to stay open and curious right in the midst of all these challenges of the workplace? And to me, That's the great question, the great practice,
Yeah.
the great aspiration is how to do that.
The other great reminder again, the other thing that I wrote down was awe.
Mhm.
And because we forget to be in awe of things that we should be in awe of.
Yeah.
And I mean, all around us, you mentioned you look out your window, you see a tree, you go for a drive, you see this magnificent countryside where I live in the south of France. Sometimes you just need to remind yourself that this is absolutely stunning, and not just be in your head as you're driving around the place. So
Yeah.
I love those two things of curiosity. Mark, this is fascinating. We could go on, and I think maybe we will come back and have another conversation on this topic. But in the interest of kind of sticking to, well, I haven't stuck to the time, but two questions I ask everybody: what is a book other than your own that's made an impact? What's the book, and what was the impact?
A book that I talk about that kind of set me on this path um, is a book by Abraham Maslow. This book from probably 40 years ago called Toward a Psychology of Being. And I read that book when I was 20 years old, and he describes how there was a small slice of the population that seemed to be a lot more genuine and happier and aware and felt more deeply than the average person. And I was just really struck by one, I was struck by how I was not one of those people. And I was way on the other end of the spectrum. I was quite asleep to myself and to my own feelings. And that book kind of shook me uh, and kind of
Wow.
set me on the path of being more curious.
Oh, great. I love that. Daily rituals. I'm pretty sure I know one you have anyway, but what daily rituals, what are they and how do they serve you?
Yeah, my morning ritual every morning I do 20 or 30 minutes of meditation. I usually start with 10 or 15 minutes of some stretching and 10 or 15 minutes of study, something. Usually it's usually something either in the leadership world or the spiritual world or yeah, but those are three things that I find as a important part of my opening day.
Well, that's fantastic. Mark, thank you so much. It's been a real joy, and I definitely going to reach out and organize a follow-up if you're up for it. But it's been a real joy. Where can people get in touch with you? We'll put everything in the notes, but where can they get in touch with you if they're listening right now?
Yeah, my website is marklesser.net, marclesser.net, and lots of writing and guided meditations and yeah, and information about finding clarity on there as well.
Great. Mark, thank you so much. It's been a
Thank
real
you.
pleasure and a real honor. Thank you so much indeed.
Thanks, John.